The early morning sun spilled across Maplewood Estates, a pristine suburban neighborhood with perfect lawns and polished sidewalks. From the outside, it looked like a slice of the American dream: white picket fences, manicured hedges, and rules so strict that even the length of your grass could spark a fine. But beneath the surface, Maplewood was a kingdom run by its homeowners association, an HOA infamous for its ruthless enforcement, whispered complaints, and a president who treated the neighborhood like her personal empire. Her name was Margaret Ellison, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 50s with silver hair always tied in a tight bun. To her, rules were everything. And anyone who threatened those rules became her enemy. So when a black woman moved into one of the largest homes on Maplewood Drive, Margaret's radar went off immediately. The moving truck rolled in on a Saturday morning, heavy with boxes, leather furniture, and a few mysterious crates. Neighbors peeked through their blinds, whispering over phone calls. At the center of it all was Danielle Carter. Tall, broad-shouldered, and striking, Danielle carried herself with quiet authority. She had deep brown skin, sharp cheekbones, and an aura that made people straighten up without knowing why. But she wasn't just anyone. Danielle was Sheriff Danielle Carter, recently elected as the county's first black female sheriff. She had spent 20 years climbing the ranks of law enforcement, earning respect the hard way. She didn't broadcast her title. She preferred privacy. To her new neighbors, she was just the woman moving into Lot 42. And that mystery made Margaret uneasy. 3 days after Danielle moved in, Margaret showed up with her clipboard and a smile that was more blade than warmth. "Good morning," she chirped, knocking on the freshly painted blue door. "I'm Margaret Ellison, president of the Maplewood Estates HOA. I just wanted to, introduce myself and go over some of our guidelines." Danielle opened the door slowly, still in her sweatpants, sipping coffee. She raised an eyebrow. "Guidelines?" she repeated. "Yes," Margaret said briskly. "For example, we prefer neutral house colors. White, beige, soft gray. That blue of yours, it's not on the approved list. I'm afraid you'll have to repaint." Danielle chuckled softly. "Ma'am, I just moved in 3 days ago." "And 3 days is enough time to start making corrections," Margaret snapped, thrusting a pamphlet into Danielle's hands. Danielle didn't argue. She just stared, calm, steady, and unflinching. It was the kind of stare that made criminals confess and rookies sit up straighter. Margaret, unused to being silently sized up, shifted uncomfortably. "Well," Margaret muttered, "I'm sure you'll make the right choice. Welcome to Maplewood." From that day on, Margaret kept a close eye on Danielle. Every time she stepped out, whether to water her plants, jog down the street, or bring in groceries, someone from the HOA board just happened to be nearby, watching. "She's too secretive," Margaret complained in a meeting. "We don't know her job. She doesn't come to events. And that door color. She pays her dues," one board member pointed out. "But rules are rules," Margaret snapped. "And I won't have Maplewood standards slipping." The spark came 2 weeks later. Danielle hosted a quiet backyard barbecue, just family, maybe a dozen people. Laughter drifted into the street, music played low from a speaker. But to Margaret, it was an infraction. She stormed down the street, clipboard in hand, and confronted Danielle mid-burger flip. "You need to shut this down," Margaret hissed. "Parties must be pre-approved by the HOA." Danielle calmly set down her tongs. "It's a family dinner. Not a rave." "Don't play games with me," Margaret snapped. "I know trouble when I see it. And if you don't comply." She didn't finish the sentence. But Danielle's eyes narrowed, just enough to flash steel. "You have a nice evening, ma'am," she said firmly, and turned her back. Margaret's jaw dropped. No one had ever dismissed her like that. The next morning, Margaret was fuming. "She's dangerous," she told the HOA board. "She disrespected me. She has strange visitors. She doesn't follow rules." We cannot allow this. And then she said the words that would set everything in motion. I'm calling the police. The call was short, clipped, and dripping with false urgency. Yes, officer, it's Margaret Ellison from Maplewood Estates. We have a new resident causing disturbances. Loud parties, suspicious behavior. I think she may be dangerous. Can you send someone? Within 30 minutes, 2 squad cars rolled into Maplewood, sirens briefly flashing before cutting off. Neighbors peeked out their blinds again, whispers rippling like wildfire. Margaret stood at the edge of the driveway, smug. This would put Danielle in her place. What Margaret didn't know, what no one in Maplewood knew, was that the woman she had just reported was not only law-abiding, but the highest-ranking law enforcement officer in the county. And Danielle Carter was about to show them exactly who she was. The officers approached Danielle's house, radios crackling. Margaret folded her arms, watching triumphantly. But when Danielle opened the door, dressed sharply in her sheriff's uniform, badge gleaming on her chest, the entire street froze. The cops stiffened. The neighbors gasped. And Margaret's face went pale as chalk. Because she had just sent the police after the sheriff herself. The squad cars slowed to a crawl in front of the blue-doored house, their tires crunching on the pristine asphalt. Neighbors leaned against their windows, phones recording, hungry for scandal. Margaret adjusted her pearl necklace and stepped closer, expecting to watch Danielle marched out in handcuffs. But when the front door swung open, the air itself seemed to shift. Danielle stood framed in the doorway, no longer in her sweatpants and hoodie. This time, she wore the deep navy uniform of her office, brass buttons catching the sunlight, the sheriff's star gleaming on her chest like fire. Her posture was firm, her chin high, her eyes sharp as blades. The 2 officers approaching her froze mid-step. Recognition flickered instantly across their faces. Sheriff Carter, one of them stammered, lowering his hand from his belt. We didn't realize. What's the problem here, gentlemen? Danielle asked, voice steady and commanding, carrying down the quiet street. The neighbors' whispers intensified. Margaret's mouth opened, then closed. She looked between Danielle and the officers, confused. One officer cleared his throat. We received a complaint about disturbances. Possible violations, suspicious activity. Danielle folded her arms. From who? Both officers hesitated. Slowly, their eyes shifted toward Margaret. The color drained from Margaret's face. Danielle let the silence stretch, each second heavier than the last. The murmurs from the watching crowd were no longer about Danielle, they were about Margaret. Finally, Danielle spoke. Officers, I appreciate your quick response. But as you can see, there's nothing suspicious here. Just me, in my own home. Next time you receive a call like this, make sure the caller isn't using your department as their personal intimidation tool. The words landed like a hammer. The officers both nodded sharply. Yes, ma'am. Understood. They backed away, climbing into their squad cars, eyes flicking nervously at Margaret as though she were the one under investigation. Engines rumbled to life, and within seconds, the flashing lights were gone. Silence swept the street. Danielle's gaze finally shifted to Margaret. Calm. Controlled. But beneath the calm was a heat that made Margaret's chest tighten. You have a good afternoon, Danielle said coolly, before closing the door. The sound of it echoed like a gavel striking. That evening, the HOA president's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Half the neighborhood wanted answers. You called the cops on the sheriff, one resident sneered at the board meeting that night. Do you know how bad you made us all look? Another snapped. She's literally the highest law enforcement officer in the county. What were you thinking? Margaret tried to defend herself. She was hosting unregistered gatherings. She broke rules. But the more she spoke, the more isolated she became. Even her loyal board members looked uneasy. "She embarrassed us," whispered one neighbor to another. "And if the sheriff decides to make this official?" The rumor mill churned like wildfire. Danielle hadn't lifted a finger, but Margaret's power, the iron grip she'd held for years, was already starting to crack. Inside her home, Danielle sat at her kitchen table, sipping tea. She wasn't surprised. This wasn't the first time someone had underestimated her, and it wouldn't be the last. But this time was different. This time, the target on her back wasn't just about her being a black woman in a wealthy neighborhood. It was about control, intimidation, and abuse of authority. And Danielle Carter had spent her entire career dismantling abuse of authority. Her eyes narrowed. The HOA thought they could bully her. They thought they could bend her. They had no idea the storm they had just unleashed. The next week, Maplewood Estates didn't feel like the same neighborhood. The perfect lawns and clipped hedges couldn't cover the tension simmering in the air. People crossed the street to whisper. Garage doors stayed cracked open, eyes peering out. Every block seemed to buzz with one question: what would the sheriff do next? Margaret tried to carry herself with the same authority as before. She walked her usual evening rounds with clipboard in hand, tapping her pen against the metal, scanning for grass too long or mailboxes painted the wrong shade of white. But the same neighbors who once trembled at her knock now shut their doors before she reached them. She could feel her power slipping. And she knew exactly whose fault it was. Inside her home, Danielle spread a folder of documents across the dining table. It wasn't HOA rules or bylaws she was studying, it was complaints. Her office had received dozens of them over the years, all from Maplewood Estates. Petty citations. Selective enforcement. Targeted harassment. They'd never risen high enough to warrant a county investigation, until now. Danielle flipped through them slowly. A black couple fined for parking violations, though their car was in their driveway. A Latino family warned 3 times for improper fencing, when other homes had the same style. A single mother threatened with eviction over a backyard playset. Patterns emerged. Ugly patterns. It wasn't just about her blue door. It was about control. Power. Discrimination dressed in the thin veil of standards. And now that veil was tearing. That Friday, Danielle made her first move. She didn't call a press conference, didn't storm the HOA office. She simply walked into the next scheduled HOA board meeting. The room went silent. Margaret, sitting at the head of the long oak table, stiffened. Her pearls seemed tighter against her neck. "This is a closed meeting," she said sharply. Danielle set a badge on the table. The polished star glinted under the fluorescent light. "Not anymore," she replied evenly. Whispers erupted. A couple of board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Margaret's lips trembled, but she forced a smile. "Well, Sheriff Carter. To what do we owe the pleasure?" Danielle didn't sit. She stood tall, her presence filling the room. "I'm here because I've been reviewing complaints from this neighborhood. Many of them trace back to this board. And I want to make one thing perfectly clear: law enforcement will not be used as a weapon for your personal grudges." The words dropped like stones. One man at the table muttered, "She's right. I told you we were going too far." Silence. Margaret barked, but her voice cracked. Danielle's gaze didn't leave hers. Calm. Cold. Certain. "If I see another call made under false pretenses, if I see harassment disguised as bylaws, I will open a full county investigation into this HOA. And I promise you, I will not stop until every ounce of corruption is dragged into the light." For the first time, Margaret couldn't find words. Her pen slipped from her hand and clattered against the table. Danielle picked up her badge, slid it back into her pocket, and turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "Oh," she added without looking back, "and my door stays blue." The slam of the door behind her sent a ripple through the room. Half the board members avoided Margaret's eyes. The empire she'd built over decades had just been split down the middle. And outside the meeting hall, word spread like fire. The sheriff wasn't backing down. She was coming for them. Night settled heavy over Maplewood Estates, but Margaret didn't sleep. She sat by her desk with a glass of wine clutched in one hand, HOA bylaws spread before her like weapons. Her empire was cracking, and she could feel the whispers closing in. Corruption. That was the word the sheriff had used. The very sound of it gnawed at Margaret's bones. She wasn't about to let some newcomer, uniform or not, strip her of power. So, she called a meeting. Not the usual HOA gathering where minutes were recorded and residents could attend. This one was in her living room, curtains drawn tight, a hushed circle of her most loyal allies. "She's making us look like fools," Margaret hissed, pacing. "If she opens an investigation, everything we've done will be dragged into the open." "What about the contracts?" one man whispered nervously. Margaret's head snapped toward him. "Exactly. Do you want the county seeing where the HOA money really went?" Silence hung thick. Everyone knew what she meant: the sweetheart deals, the construction projects awarded to relatives, the fines pocketed instead of deposited. Danielle Carter wasn't just a threat. She was a ticking time bomb. "So we stop her," Margaret declared. "Before she stops us." Across town, Danielle sat in her office long after dark. Files covered her desk, stacks of complaints, financial statements she'd subpoenaed, and letters from residents too scared to speak up until now. Her deputy knocked softly on the door. "Boss, you should head home. You've been at this all day." Danielle didn't look up. "I can't. Not yet. There's something here. Something big." She tapped a paper with her finger. The HOA's books showed thousands collected in fines, but only half of that money ever made it into the official account. The rest vanished, funneled into shell companies tied to Margaret's brother-in-law. Her lips pressed into a thin line. This wasn't about blue doors or barbecue parties. It was fraud. Theft. Abuse of power on a scale that could bring the entire HOA crumbling down. And Margaret knew it. The next morning, Danielle jogged through the neighborhood like she always did. Except now, the air felt different. People smiled at her, waved, even stopped to say hello. "Sheriff Carter, we've lived here 10 years and no one's ever stood up to them," an older man whispered, gripping her hand. "We're with you. All of us." The whispers weren't whispers anymore. They were voices, gathering strength. From her window, Margaret watched the scene unfold, rage burning her cheeks. Each wave, each smile, was another crack in her control. She turned away from the window, grabbed her phone, and dialed a number she hadn't used in years. When the voice answered on the other end, Margaret said only one thing. "We need to make a problem for her. Something big. Something that will shut her down before she destroys us." That night, a patrol unit reported something strange. A brick had been thrown through Danielle Carter's front window. No witnesses. No cameras. Just shattered glass glittering across the floor of her living room. She stood over it, jaw tight, breathing slow and steady. She'd faced threats before, threats far worse than this. But this wasn't about scaring her. This was about scaring the whole neighborhood into silence. And Danielle knew exactly whose fingerprints were on this crime, even if no prints were left behind. She looked at the broken glass one last time before turning to her deputy. "Get me everything we have on Margaret Ellison and this HOA. Tomorrow, we start making arrests." The sun rose over Maplewood Estates with the same golden glow it always had, but for the first time in years, the neighborhood felt different. Curtains were pulled back, neighbors stood on porches in clusters, and an unusual sense of anticipation buzzed through the air. Sheriff Danielle Carter wasn't jogging today. She was working. 2 unmarked county vehicles rolled in behind her patrol car, parking neatly at the curb. Deputies stepped out, serious-faced, files in hand. They weren't here for a welfare check, or a noise complaint, or some petty HOA dispute. They were here for justice. Danielle approached the HOA office, once a place where residents were dragged in for fines and reprimands, and pushed the glass door open. The board members were already there, Margaret sitting stiff at the head of the table as if sheer posture could hold together her crumbling empire. Danielle dropped a thick folder on the table. The papers inside fanned out, bank statements, fraudulent contracts, diverted funds. Every secret Margaret thought was buried lay exposed in black and white. "You've been stealing from your own community," Danielle said, her voice calm but cutting through the air like a blade. "Falsifying records. Targeting residents for fines that never even reached the HOA account. And when that wasn't enough, you weaponized the police to intimidate people who didn't bow to you." One of the board members shifted uncomfortably. I didn't know it was this bad." "Save it," Danielle cut in. "You all signed off on this." "But Margaret? You orchestrated it." Margaret slammed her palm against the table. "You can't prove." "Actually," Danielle interrupted, sliding a single page forward, "I can. Your brother-in-law's company received over $300,000 from HOA funds for maintenance projects that never happened. I have sworn statements. I have checks with your signature. And I have enough evidence to put you in prison for a very long time." The room went silent. The only sound was the faint buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead. Finally, Danielle nodded to her deputies. "Margaret Ellison, you are under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and misuse of law enforcement resources." The clink of handcuffs echoed like thunder. Margaret's face went white, her eyes darting to the board members who refused to meet her gaze. For the first time, the Queen of Maplewood looked small. As she was led out the door, neighbors gathered in the parking lot. Phones were out, cameras recording. They watched their once untouchable HOA president shoved into the back of a patrol car, her empire collapsing in real time. And then, for the first time in years, Maplewood Estates erupted in applause. Weeks later, the neighborhood looked transformed. The blue door on Danielle's house gleamed brighter than ever, standing proud among a sea of beige. Children played on sidewalks without fear of citations. Families repainted fences, planted gardens, even set up lawn chairs to chat in the evenings. The HOA hadn't been dissolved, but it had been rebuilt. New leadership. Transparency. Real community. And at the center of it all was Danielle Carter, not just as their sheriff, but as their neighbor. One evening, a resident approached her as she watered her plants. "You didn't just save us from Margaret," he said. "You gave us our home back." Danielle smiled softly, setting the hose aside. "No," she replied, "we did it. Together." She only had power because everyone was afraid. Once people stop being afraid, bullies lose everything. The man nodded, his eyes shining with relief. As the sun dipped behind the houses, the sheriff leaned against her porch railing, watching the children laugh, the families gather, and the neighborhood breathe free again. Margaret's empire was gone. But Maplewood Estates had finally become what it pretended to be all along, a community. And for Danielle Carter, that was justice served.